Hey, it's Antonia. In the 6+ years Joel and I have been recording this podcast, we have rarely talked about current events. A decision we made early on was to keep our content evergreen if possible, and hopefully it would become timeless. But while we faced global epidemics before, it's been a while since humans have seen one this easily communicable. I am, of course, referring to the global pandemic of the coronavirus, or COVID-19. And so I'm going to capitalize on whatever credibility I may have gained from you. If you've ever thought I was even a tiny bit smart and thoughtful about stuff, I'm going to do what I can to persuade you to intentionally quarantine yourself. And if you're not in a position to do that, then take every precaution to socially distance yourself. Why, you may say? I'm young and healthy. I can get the virus and survive. But you getting the virus now may be killing someone else later. I'll use the United States, the country I live in, as an example of why this is so important. I'm about to get a little TI data heavy here, so please stick with me. The majority of cases of COVID-19 or coronavirus are relatively mild. There are flu-like symptoms and most people can stay home. But that means 20% are severe and require hospitalization. Of those 20%, around 5% are critical, and half of those critical cases require ventilators, or what's called an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machine, or an ECMO. As of a couple years ago, there were only around 250 ECMO machines in the entire United States. In fact, the machines and the programs they rely upon are so costly that there was a debate on whether or not they were worth the expense. So we can't just make more of them quickly. So 250 or thereabouts are what we're stuck with. Okay, so let's say we have 100,000 people who simultaneously contract the virus. Of those 100,000 people, about 20,000 will need hospitalization, and 5,000 will be the critical cases that need to be in ICU. 1,000 of them will need machines that we don't have enough of. At the time of this recording, we're not anywhere near that number of 100,000 people contracting it yet. But we're already experiencing the same exponential growth curve that other countries have seen. So 100,000 simultaneous cases isn't an insane number. But here's the deal. If we spread it out over time, then those same 1,000 people that need the ECMO machine get to use that same machine. Because critical case number 974 contracted the virus 2 months after critical case number 142, and now it's available. So this whole I'm young and healthy, so it doesn't matter if I get it mentality doesn't track. If you happen to be a critical case and you get it now, and a person in their 70s gets it now, and enough people are getting it now, you end up killing the 7-year-old because the doctor has to decide which of you they're going to give access to the ECMO machine. You're in their 20s, they're in their 70s. As cavalier as your decision to go and drink at a bar was because you're invincible, they're still going to keep your dumb butt alive because that's how priorities work. Doctors don't give out Darwin Awards. We also need to account for people who simply cannot stay home. Working parents who have service industry jobs, people who are keeping our utilities and supply chains going, and those in the medical industry themselves. They don't have a choice. But if you do, please do not put a doctor in this position of having to choose to kill someone else to save you. If you can, please stay home. Let's pace this thing out and turn a 4% mortality rate into a 0.5% mortality rate. Okay, thanks for staying with me. Please be healthy, make smart choices, and take this truly serious global pandemic seriously. Okay, now back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So I realized something about myself recently, probably in the last year. I don't have a lot of fear around dying. I think I have a lot of fear around suffering, like being sick, suffering, being hurt. When we were in Egypt recently, and we were on our Nile River boat that we were going down the Nile River, I remember I got deathly ill for like a 24-hour period. And man, that was a tough time for me. That was a really, really emotionally tough time for me because I was sick. You know, we're in another country. I was unsure of myself. I felt a little insecure because I didn't know the medical system. I didn't know medicine. Like you go to a pharmacy, I don't speak the language. I didn't know the kind of medicines they had there. It was a little anxiety producing for me, just being sick there. And then just the physical ailments itself, the suffering of being sick was really challenging for me. And I remember sitting there in bed, really, really ill, thinking to myself, man, this feels like death to me. Like I almost rather be dead than this. This is so distressing. And it was a tough emotional experience, not just physical, but emotional for me. And that's typically for me, I think I have a challenge when I get sick emotionally. I don't know if that's a type thing, specifically to ENFPs or maybe just myself. But I realized that I don't fear actually my life ending as much as I fear the suffering of life. And I've talked to other people about this, and I noticed that some people fear their death more than they fear suffering. So I think it's a really interesting thing about us humans is we have often fears that lie in things that other people we assume would share with us, but sometimes they don't.
At the time of this recording, I think that all of us are dealing with some anxiety, though.
Yeah.
Or at least at least a good percentage of the population. And it's because we are dealing with, I would say, probably the most disruptive global pandemic that I've ever experienced in my life. There have been other global pandemics in my life. There was the AIDS epidemic. There have been other flu-like, epidemics that have swept through, but nothing with the level of contagiousness that we're dealing with right now, which is, at the time of this recording, is COVID-19 or coronavirus. And I don't really want to make this entire podcast necessarily about the virus itself because, well, first of all, we only know what we're being told. So it's not like we're experts or anything. But I do know that at the time period of this recording, there is anxiety just as an atmosphere around us. It's like an ozone that's just covering everything. And you and I have been doing a lot of work to try to stay chill because it's not easy to stay chill. And I would say, man, considering the situation and circumstances we could be in, we might be some of the luckiest people on the planet. We live 10 miles outside of town in a house that's, large enough for our family. We have enough entertainment in our house to keep us entertained because we're doing, we're volunteering to quarantine ourselves because we feel like that's the right thing to do. We have internet. This time period in history where we have internet piped through, and we have an online business. So we don't have to necessarily stop what we're doing and go home and feel anxious. I mean, obviously, we have some anxiety around, how the economy is going to be impacted and whether or not any businesses will be able to generate any income because of the economy. And so there's, sort of general anxiety around that. But as far as trying to keep things business as usual, our children are in cyber school. And so we use, PA Cyber, and so which is Pennsylvania Cyber School, which is one of the best in the country. Most of our lives are digital. And we did that because we're freedom junkies.
Yeah.
And we just wanted to create a life that allowed us to pick up and move at any time. And of course, we're both ENPs. And so that's our extroverted intuition or exploration driver wanting to do that. And very, maybe not ironically, maybe this is how it always works. But now, because we built this life that is catered to our driver dominant function of extroverted intuition, we have more opportunity to keep our routines going and stay in sort of an introverted sensing or memory place. Like we can try to keep our lives steady right now. And I know we're very fortunate in that. Not everybody has the ability to keep their lives as steady, right? Like a lot of kids are being sent home from school because they're shutting schools down, and people are being sent home from jobs. And it's really a very anxiety-producing time period in history. And I know I've seen a lot of people in the type community right now talking about how different personality types deal with anxiety and stress. And I think we do kind of want to touch a little bit on that. But I think I more want to focus in this podcast on some of the things that we might be able to do to keep our anxiety mitigated, like to keep our as chill as possible during this time period. And you and I talked about it, Joel, before the podcast. We were like, so should we do like a top 5 list, or what should we do here? But I don't know if I want to do that either, because I don't know if I have a top 5 list. I've never gone through a time period like this before. I don't know if I have quality advice. I just don't know. I know what we're doing to try to keep ourselves calm and to try to keep ourselves in a good space. But I don't, I don't necessarily, I'm not an expert here, right? So I think we want to also open up a dialogue and maybe get people, you, the listener, and the community to talk about what you're doing to, keep yourself in a good space. Because our audience is filled with a lot of intuitives. And I think intuitives are in some ways profoundly affected, if not personally, if they're not even personally feeling some of this. A lot of intuitives, particularly the ones who have, highly sensitive personalities or are empathic, they're, you listener are probably absorbing stuff like crazy. And then for those of you who are sensors, if you're a sensor in the audience, the intuitive part of you might be going crazy, trying to pattern recognize what's going to happen next. And it might feel catastrophic, or it might feel like no big deal because you're trying to push away any sense of anxiety. So we all deal with things a little differently depending upon our personality type. But I think because none of us really know what to do, or at least most of us don't, this is less about, it's a little bit about how our decision-making function is going to react and respond, because we do have to make decisions in this time period. But I think it's more focused on how our perceiving function is likely to behave, because we're taking in information and we're trying to collate it as quickly as possible and determine its meaning. So I've been having conversations with Charis, who works with us at Personality Hacker, who's an INFJ. And I'm noticing the difference between how her introverted intuition or perspectives function is operating differently than my extroverted intuition or exploration. She's trying to future pace, but it feels a little bit more pessimistic. And then when I try to future pace, I'm using exploration. And I've noticed that, staying true to form, I'm way more optimistic about all of this. And I'm kind of hoping things like the concept of this is all to my benefit, even if it's a really bad thing. I'm trying to see how this is disruptive to world events and how it could maybe turn out in a positive way.
The thing that comes to mind for me is really anytime we talk about anything, we tend to come down to this idea of tension points and balance. And on one hand, there's some serious things happening in the world that we all have to take serious. We've got to be helpful to each other on a global scale and take things very serious, have maybe severe thinking in how we operate our lives for a while to protect all of us against, a common enemy, if you will. And on the other side, we are talking about an illness that as long as it doesn't overload the systems and we can get ahead of it, we're probably going to be okay as humanity. So if we can find the tension between, it'll be fine, people get sick and that's cool, we'll get through, versus, let's lock everything down and be panicked. That tension between those two is really difficult to strike sometimes. And when you're dealing with a lot of people on a global scale who have a lot of difference, we deal with personality types. We understand how people are so differently wired, and then groups of people get together and groupthink takes over. So different countries have different styles and ways of thinking, different ways of doing things. It's just a lot of coordination. And I think that balanced thinking is key for myself. The thing that keeps coming to me is I look at the opportunity in all of this. And again, that's that extroverted intuition, right? Where is the what if question? Where's the opportunity in things? What are the positives that can come from some things like this? And, this pandemic right now may be something that is severe and difficult, and we get through it as humans, and it prepares us for the next one that may be way more difficult or challenging. And we have a wake-up call. And so I look at that and I go, that's probably that's in the plus column. That's in the good side of things. Like, we're going to be more prepared if this ever happens again, because we're going to have been through it before. And the other thing is, I also look at history. And this is one of the things I think in history is so important for people to learn, to have a perspective of what happens now. When you don't have a sense of history or what's come before, things seem overwhelming and challenging, like this. We've never seen anything like this. And it's true. We've never seen anything just like this, but we have seen large-scale pandemics before, as far as the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. We've seen the influenza in 1918 on a global scale. We've been through multiple world wars, and we've seen a lot of trauma happen in the world before. And we've seen how generations before us, my grandfather's generation, my grandparents' generation, went through the Great Depression and World War II. And we see how they made it through. We see what they had to do during that time period to make it through. And I heard stories about it. And so I have a perspective of, okay, this is surmountable. We can get through this as humans if we all band together and fight this as a common enemy, just like we've done before as humans. It just those people aren't alive today to tell us, hey, it's going to be okay, right? A lot of those people have already passed away from the World War II generation. So there's not a sense of hey, young ones, we got this, it's okay. We can make it through if we work together. So I think that's important, is to look at history, look at what's come before, understand that, and then also look at the opportunities in front of us. So the past and the future is really interesting to me at this point, striking the tension between those two things. That helps me a lot in thinking about this.
Yeah. When you say opportunity, I just want to make sure that it doesn't come across to sound opportunistic.
That's correct. I'm not talking about selling water for $10 a gallon. No, or like or like selling toilet paper or hand sanitizer, $30 a bottle or a roll or something like that. That's not at all what I'm referring to.
Yeah, those people are dicks. I'm sorry, but if you're one of those people, you're a dick. I think, you and I oftentimes feel like we have more control over something if we can understand it. And I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true, but it's a placebo, right? Like if I can just understand what's going on. And when you're talking about opportunities, it's more like, so this, this situation it's a disruptive technology. We've talked about disruptive technologies before, and it's a disruptive technology. It's incredibly disruptive. It's going to disrupt everything, and life might be different from here on out. And what are the ways in which this could benefit us, I think is basically what you're trying to say.
As a collective, not just us personally.
Yeah, exactly. As a collective, as a species. And I think this is where models come in super helpful, because I think when you feel like life is happening to you and you have no idea what the implications of something are, and it could go either way, I think that produces the most amount of anxiety, because anxiety is all about fear of the future, right? Like that's what the emotion of anxiety literally is fear of the future, fear of something coming that you cannot predict or prepare for. And if we look at things through the lens of some of the maps and models that, that we've been talking about on the podcast, I don't think it's good. I don't think it's okay. I don't think there's going to be a lot of people who lose loved ones, or maybe get very sick themselves, or, get into a truly financial crisis. I think the one thing that makes me feel a little better is that we're all in it together. Right? Like if it's not just one person who's in a financial crisis because they don't have their shit together. It's like all of us are going to kind of experience it together. And at the same time, there's different ways to look at it through the lens of some of these maps and models that make it so that even though it's not okay, even though this could be bad, there might be ways in which, like in the long-term implications, it might actually serve us as a species. There's
this idea that Ryan, INTP Ryan, he worked with us for a while, a couple years ago. He brought this concept to us. He talked about it being black box thinking. He said a lot of young people, he's in his 20s, and he said a lot of young people have black box thinking. I said, what do you mean black box thinking? What's that? He said, it's this idea that there's a box that does some sort of function. The box can be literal, like a TV or some kind of electronic equipment, or it could just be a metaphor for the things we do in life. And we pull up that black box. Let's say it's a Uber Eats app. We pull up the Uber Eats app, we order food, that food's delivered to us in 20 minutes. We have zero idea how all that works. I mean, we have a kind of a general idea, like somebody gets alerted, the money goes over here, somebody fulfills the order, they drive it to my house. I mean, we have a general sense of it. And that's probably an easy one as an example, but there's a bunch of stuff happening that we're not sure how that's happening. It just happens for us on this interface that we have. And we go through the world and we interface with the world. Our systems are so complex. We interface with the world in this black box thinking. We push buttons here, this happens over here. We engage and we tweak this knob over here, and this happens over here. We order this, we call this, we post this, and these things all happen for us. And we don't really know how they happen. Like, do you know how all these things happen in your life? Probably not. Do you know where your electricity is generated? Do you actually know where that power station is, for example, where your electricity comes from to your house? Probably not. Maybe there's some people that do. But a lot of us have this black box thinking. We just have things happening in our modern world. So I think what this is going to do is it's going to give us a perspective, an understanding how things really work, like how things fundamentally work on a core physical level. And probably for us intuitives, that's going to be really powerful. Sometimes sensors might have a little better handle on this. I know my sensor son loves to watch that show on TV, like Factory Show, where they show like how food is made or how like products are made in factories. And he like watches the process, like how it's made or whatever on the DIY channel or YouTube and stuff. And I often watch that, and my little baby SI is like fascinated by how stuff happens, right? I'm just like, oh, that's really interesting how they build that. I never realized that's how that thing is made. And I think a lot of us are going to get a perspective of that, like how food is grown, how supplies get from one place to another, how things happen in our world. The curtain is going to be pulled back, and our eyes will be open. And if we can use models like you talked about, Antonia, to organize information and understanding for decision making, I think a lot of people will be poised to make really good decisions and understand their world better. It's going to be I see that as an opportunity to benefit for us, to really fundamentally understand what's going on at the core level of things.
Yeah, and also to be more self-reliant.
Yeah.
The reason why we're able to have black box thinking is because everything is done for us. We are exceptionally spoiled as humans at this point. I mean, at least in Western cultures, in the United States especially. And I think it has allowed us to be very picky about things. Like, we're very picky about everything. We are used to really an elevated level of comfort and kind of an unreasonable expectation of comfort, in my opinion. And I think when we face things that are this unsettling, I think the thing, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you fear suffering more than you fear death. And I think
I'm soft. That's why.
Yeah, we all are, aren't we? We're so soft. And I think we define suffering in a different way than our ancestors did. Like our ancestors defined suffering as like constant and perpetual physical pain, right? Going through a terrible time period where there was like no medicine and you just had to keep going through it, right? That movie Alpha it's such a great movie. And the kid who like had to survive these crazy circumstances, approximately 20,000 years ago in the movie. I mean, it's like he broke his leg and he had to like, sort of reset it himself and create some sort of, handmade splint and keep going. I mean, it was awful. Or the suffering that happens with, when somebody who is part of your tiny little tribe dies. But we define suffering as like, I'm not as comfortable as I'm used to being. Like, I'm suffering because I don't have like controlled temperature rooms, or somebody said something mean to me and now I'm suffering, right? I think we throw the phrase PTSD on almost everything at this point. So I think this time period, if we allow it to, might help us massively reprioritize and have maybe a much needed calibration on what really suffering actually is and what level of comfort we truly should be expecting. And this is disruptive to comfort. It's disruptive to comfort more than anything else. Now, I'm not trying to indicate that it's not also going to cause true suffering. It is and will, right? It will continue to cause more suffering than just, I'm not sitting in my lazy boy eating potato chips right now. Like legit suffering is wrapped up in all of this as well. But also, I don't have toilet paper. Oh no, right? It's like, is that really a level of suffering, or is that just, I don't want to not comfortable, right? Like I want to be comfortable. And by the way, I just want to say, we've been predicting this for a long time. Because we told you to get 11 copies of the Personality Hacker book for the apocalypse.
We warned you.
And now we have many copies of our book. It's a 400 and some odd page book. So we're like, that whole toilet paper thing, we're set.
That's right.
So if you had 11 copies of the book, you'd have a copy to read, a copy to rebuild civilization, and 10 copies to use as toilet paper during the time period of the coronavirus. So we're actually set. But that said, that's not having toilet paper isn't suffering. So I think that one of the things that will happen is that we might get real clear, real calibrated on exactly what suffering is. I think another thing, looking at it through the lens again of all these models, one of the first models that comes to mind is the tribal leadership model. Now, we talked about this in a podcast a very long time ago. And if you haven't heard that podcast, I highly recommend going back and listening to it, because it's one of my favorite models that prescribes or diagnoses and prescribes morale, which right now is what we're talking about, right? Keeping your morale up. And in the model, David Logan and the people who helped him write that book talks about a level called tribal level 4. It's after 3, and the world, as far as I'm concerned, is very much stuck in tribal level 3. Tribal level 3 is a mentality of I'm awesome and everybody else sucks. And that tends to be sort of how we go through life. We all feel like we're awesome and everybody else are the people who should be doing better. But when you go to tribal level 4, you have a sense of simpatico with the people around you. You have a shared thing you're trying to accomplish. And they mention in the book that one of the elements that encourages people to go from the I'm awesome, everybody else sucks, up until we're awesome is a shared enemy. And a virus, a global epidemic, is as close to an alien attack, an alien invasion, as we're probably going to ever see. And so we can collectively as humans get together to fight this alien invasion, which gets us up to tribal level 4, which gives us a sense of simpatico, a sense of sort of like global cooperation that allows us to, to have higher morale as a species.
I agree. I think there is an opportunity for more morale. I actually think humans are going to bind together here. I think we're going to find our way out of this in a very healthy way. I think we have a tipping point of enough people who have enough sophistication. I do think we are always a few clicks away from, devolving into primal behavior. But I don't think we're going to go there. I think this is going to actually do well for the world ultimately. I think things are going to become more localized. I think we're going to find people becoming more community focused out of this. Search for more sustainability and self-reliance. And I think we're going to see a global community come together to say, how can we conquer things like this now and in the future together and have things in place? And I think you're going to see more cooperation from humans. Maybe not right away. Maybe there'll be a little bit of infighting. At first there's some fighting, blame shifting, and there's that tribal 3, I'm awesome, you suck. Our country's awesome, your country over there sucks, whatever kind of thinking. But ultimately, I think when the threat becomes great enough, the blame stops and you start to work together to find solutions because you realize you're all in this together. And I think that I have faith that humans are going to find that pathway out. And I think that the speed of information and communication and globalization is going to help us in a lot of ways here. And it's going to also force us to think in terms of what can we do back home in whatever country you live in, to create that sustainability, that independence, that self-reliance, and then connecting with people more on a federated level, like cooperation because you want to, not because you have to. I think that's going to be coming down the road. And I'm eager and optimistic about that kind of thing.
Well, there will always be that bickering. There will always be people who are opportunistic.
Of course.
Right. And there's always going to be people who give humanity a bad name. Already there's conspiracy theory about how this virus could have been intentional and maybe some country let it loose on the planet so that they could gain dominance. And who knows? I don't often cut into conspiracy theories because you just cannot know. And so Robert Anton Wilson talks about how conspiracy theories are for people whose third eye chakra has been opened and their heart chakra has not. And so I always try to keep my heart chakra open when I think about that sort of thing. It's like, could it be a conspiracy theory? Maybe. Or conspiracy. Could it be something was really terrible? Maybe. But if your heart chakra is open too, you can also look for ways where it's like, well, as you mentioned, Joel, maybe it's also a warning shot to the planet, right? Like maybe this is a manageable epidemic coming through. What if it's followed later by a vastly less manageable epidemic? And maybe we need to all get our shit together as countries. You can see the countries that have gone through epidemics before, 15, 20 years ago, really serious ones, and they seem to be doing better than everybody else because they were like, oh yeah, we know how to handle this and we're prepared for it. So maybe this will help humanity in general prepare for things like this. That's not to say it's not bad. I just want you, the listener, I just want you to know that this is not a extroverted intuition exploration sort of everything's going to be fine and dandy, sort of message. It's not okay, right? Like everything's not okay. And also, if you see it through certain lenses, you can understand where it's also not completely gloom and doom, right? There are things it's the Shiva Shakti principle, right? It's the forest fire. Whenever anything terrible happens, there's always something that, like, the regrowth happens afterwards. And those things can be positive, and you can focus on those things for understanding, and also to not just roll over. Because that's really, to keep morale up, the number one thing you have to do is you have to keep yourself from rolling over and giving up, or allowing yourself to just descend into a ball of anxiety, whether it's your anxiety or the anxieties of people around you and that are like fueling yours. Like, for those of you who are highly sensitive people, if you are a person who's highly empathic and you just slurp up everybody else's emotions, it's time to get really good at cord cutting, right? And get really good at figuring out how to shield yourself from the energies of other people. We've done podcasts on cord cutting ceremonies. Cord cutting is when you have these these invisible energetic cords to people outside of yourself that end up impacting and affecting you with their energy. And while it usually happens with single individuals, you can also sort of have a cord to society, a cord where it's like an open tunnel of society's stuff that ends up impacting and affecting you. And you might want to go back and listen to that podcast and do some cord cutting ceremonies with society itself and get a little bit of distance, from yourself and everybody else, so that you can be in your own experience and not feel like you have to carry the weight of the collective experience. I want to harken back to something you mentioned about sustainability and self-reliance. One way in which all of this could potentially be to our benefit is that we in the Western world, particularly young people, have been really battling with low self-esteem in general for years and years and years. Like, generationally, younger generations, millennials and on down, have some of the highest suicide rates that we've seen ever, really. Like, since World War, since people were dealing with shell shock during, post-World Wars, we have extraordinarily high suicide rates. And one of the things that I've speculated on that is the further away we get from self-reliance, the more we are relying on things that come out of black boxes, the more we hand our survival and our safety and security over to other people, the less we have proven to ourselves our capacity to step up. We don't have self-esteem if we don't have self-reliance. And our world is built to have us be completely reliant on these systems, to a point where we get upset when those systems don't serve us the way we want them to serve us. One of the challenges we have in the modern world is that we are looking to systems to solve all of our problems. And we get agitated when those systems don't. We demand those systems solve all of our problems, all the way up to comfort, right? Or even emotional comfort. I'm about to say something a little un-PC, so, for those of you who do not know that there's an un-PC part of me, well, here you go.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. I remember hearing about women in the workplace being highly offended at men doing things like in front of them having, like competitions around push-ups, and how that was like a toxic work environment. And the young woman who made this complaint wanted the system to solve for her lack of comfort in that environment. And I've worked in environments my whole life, of office environments. This is like the first time I've had a gig that was not an office environment. But I can't even imagine, number one, being uncomfortable that other people are creating a competitive situation between the two of them. And number two, feeling like the system itself should be solving my discomfort for me. Now, you might have a different opinion on that. You, the listener, you might be highly offended that I'm not offended by it, and that I'm like surprised that that's even a thing. And of course, I'm sure I'll get an email or, a series of comments under this podcast. But regardless, to me, even if you're sympathetic to the situation of whatever the complaint was, it's an illustration and an example of a general mentality about the modern world that wants the systems and institutions around it to solve our own discomfort for us. And from where I stand, or from my perspective, that actually undermines our self-esteem if we hand that kind of power over to sort of nameless institutions to solve these problems for us. Because just like a little kid that is, just naturally reliant on their parents, if their parents aren't there for them, if their parents are in any way not showing up for them, the child becomes incredibly insecure because they're massively reliant on their parent to create their entire environment for them. And when we as adults hand parental power over to institutions around us to solve these problems for us that we really should be solving on our own, we really should be handling as adults on our own, we have the same feeling of insecurity that a child has when a parent isn't coming through for them. And so the idea of growing up, the idea of becoming more self-sufficient and self-reliant on dealing with our own emotional struggles and challenges, this is something that actually builds our self-esteem, just like children that grow up into adults and become more and more and more self-reliant on parenting themselves, right? We parent ourselves, we prove and show to ourselves that we're able to deal with basic things in life, and we build commensurate self-esteem. And since our world has become so much more reliant on the systems around us to solve these problems for us, I actually think that that's why we have a one-to-one. I think there's a one-to-one correlation with that and our lack of self-esteem as people. Like, I think we are undermining our own sense of self, our own self-confidence. And I think one of the things that something like this very disruptive situation will do is it will show to us exactly what we can rely on the systems around us for and what we cannot, where we have to rely on ourselves. Like you talked about, like, what if supply chains in any way are disrupted? Like, God forbid, what if our supply chains are disrupted and we can't get food? Suddenly we're going to have to figure out how to get food for ourselves. I don't think it will go necessarily quite that apocalyptic, but I mean, I don't know. I have no idea where this will go. So the idea that we have to sort of re-empower ourselves to be self-reliant outside of systems and institutions and infrastructures, that we have to start thinking for ourselves. I mean, not thinking for ourselves paradigmatically, but thinking for ourselves tactically, right? Like logistically and tactically, set up strategic lives where we are relying on ourselves to take care of ourselves all the way in Maslow's basement, down at survival. I actually think that serves us because we will become more self-sufficient and we'll have higher self-esteem. And we won't be in this like dearth of insecurity going, oh my gosh, what if this all falls down around me? How will I survive? We'll have an answer to that. And we will survive and we'll go, oh, I am a survivor. I can get through this.
What's exciting about the survival side of things is these aren't things that our ancestors didn't have to deal with. This is knowledge that we can learn. In fact, you can go on YouTube right now and learn how to grow vegetables and learn how to hunt or, clean an animal and prepare meat or fish and clean a fish. Like, there's things you can learn to do. Now, if you're in a big city, you might be like, well, I don't have access to those things. And that's a concern, I'm sure. But there's also ways to do things even inside of urban areas that might be highly densely populated. And so, there's an opportunity to learn here and add to your knowledge base just in preparation, even if you never have to use it. It's just things that we have opportunities. Again, that's that opportunity thinking I keep thinking of. Right now, I've told my oldest son, I said, hey, why don't you start watching some YouTube videos on, how to grow vegetables and maybe how to, clean an animal for food if you needed to, just so if you have that skill. Like, this is a great opportunity to use this situation to focus you on that. I don't think you'll ever have to need it. I don't think our supply chain is going to go down. I don't think there's going to be power outages everywhere. I don't think the world's going to descend into madness, at least not from this thing. I think we're all going to get through it, and it's going to be a challenge, and there might be some hardship, and I think we're going to make it through, and I think most of our systems are going to stay intact because they're pretty resilient systems. And it's still an opportunity for us to beef up on some knowledge, some history, some wisdom that people and ancestors had before us that I think is just wise to have regardless of the systems we're plugged into. I have some black box thinking about how things happen, how my food comes to me. I don't know how to hunt, like really. I don't really know how to hunt or trap. I know how to fish a little bit.
Or grow a garden.
Yeah, I could probably plant seeds and water them, but how do you can vegetables for the wintertime? I wouldn't know how to do that.
I have no idea.
And there's people that are super into those things. They prep for the apocalypse all the time, the preppers and stuff, and they really know how to do all that stuff. But there's skills that, like, my grandmother used to can her own food. I remember her doing that. My mom used to do this as a kid. I remember, like, tomatoes in her garden. She used to put it in, like, these jars and boil water and seal it, and she'd put it in the pantry for, like, months at a time. She used to can her own vegetables and things in like, containers. So this is it's not that far information away from us. And I'm sure there's tons of YouTube videos on this kind of stuff. I hope you don't panic by me saying all that. If you're listening right now, I'm not trying to panic you. I'm just trying to illustrate some of the opportunities we might have.
Well, I think what it is it's putting things into perspective. It's about just what is our level of dependency on things around us, and how can we be more independent? How can we come to the world around us without codependence? How can we show up with interdependence?
Yeah.
By being fully independent ourselves and then being able to feed into the system as opposed to just take from the system.
And the learning your mind goes through for that kind of thing, to think through what would it take to survive, even if you never have to rely upon it, starts to change your mindset. You start to have more security in yourself, some more self-esteem like Antonia talks about. And then you have a sense of like, okay, now the little things don't seem to matter as much because you've already kind of like thought about worst case scenario in some way. Maybe this is, again, I'm self-pres repressed in the Enneagram, and I'm a SI, introverted sensing and fear, 3-year-old, as an ENFP. So like for me, it's kind of like those two little functions of myself, like the lower part of my Enneagram type and the lower part of my Myers-Briggs type almost say, okay, like if I can get like through the big survival stuff, anything else just feels so doable. So maybe it's particular to how I'm wired. And I think that it probably would be beneficial to anyone.
Yeah, I think this idea of increased independence is also something that we as a society should be looking at it through. I mean, not to get political, because I'm not a particularly, vocally political person. And I also think that we as entire collections of people or countries can also be thinking more independently. Like, we live in the United States, and the United States has outsourced all of our manufacturing and production to other countries, and really not in a good way. Like, not like all of our dependencies on countries around us, particularly the ones who, have like undercut our ability to create these goods and services at rates that are actually unsustainable. They really are. And it doesn't do any good for the country that we live in. It doesn't do any good for the other countries. Like, it just creates these systems where, people in other countries have to put nets around their buildings because they're trying to kill themselves because of the sweatshop situations. And it's like, and we all think that that's somehow okay. And even those of us who rail against it, like, we rail against it on Twitter as we're like typing into our iPhones or our smartphones.
That were built in those same buildings.
That were built in those buildings, right? And so we act like, we're really, we're so righteous when really we're actually quite hypocritical. But regardless of all of that, there might be an opportunity to be thinking in ways of, having more independence as countries as well. And then if we have independence, just like the dependency model of dependent, independent, interdependent, we can avoid codependence, which is like this idea of like not showing up as full, complete people, right? And with something to give. As countries and societies, we could show up more independent so that we can feed into things and create interdependent relationships. So the point of all of this is that as both collectives and as individuals, we have an opportunity to be more self-sufficient and prove to ourselves that we have what it takes. We have the chops to do that. And I think collectively and independently, our self-esteem increases. Another model that I'm seeing this through is the generational theory model. And generational theory, not just in terms of generations, but generational theory as it's put forth in a book called The Fourth Turning. And in that book, according to their model, Strauss and Howe's model, we are in the middle of what's called winter. And winter is always marked by a total war. We are, I believe, 12 years into winter.
Last time there was total war winter was World War II.
Exactly. And before that, it was like the Civil War. So these seasons, according to generational theory, are about 20 years long. And I think we did a generational theory podcast, didn't we?
With Jesse, I believe we did.
Yeah, Jesse Newbern. So go back and check out that model too if you're interested in that. But if each of these quote unquote seasons last 20 years, we're 12 years into winter, and that means we have 8 more years to just sort of get through it. Every time this happens, there is a total zeitgeist shift. I mean, total shift. And the world is never the same. After we get out of winter, the world is never the same. And we're going through that time period right now, according to generational theory. We're going through a time period where we are seeing a shift in how reality works for us as basically as humans, those of us that are a part of these societies. So that, again, that means that there's opportunities there. And some of it is, just like there's any transition, there's always pain and agony and tragedy that happens through major transitions. And there's also opportunities, and there are ways that we can do better coming from this. So it's not necessarily always doom and gloom and like everything's going to end. On a big, massive timeline scale, we are more than halfway through this time period, and what follows is spring. And spring is a time period of renewal and growth. So it is just a matter of getting through this time period in history and understanding we're living through history, right? What's that old curse? May you live in interesting times. That's a curse, not a blessing. And we're living through interesting times. But in some ways, that means that we're going to be able to talk about how we survived this time period and how we got through it.
So I think the key thing here is to remain calm, remain centered, keep your emotions and anxieties in check. And I think Antonia has put forth a lot of different models here. Being TI, introverted thinking, as an ENTP, Antonia, probably understanding things and just having models and maps to place things on makes so much intuitive sense to you.
I know it's a placebo, but it makes me feel better.
Well, and I think that's I think a lot of people feel that way. I don't think it's just introverted thinking people, just the TPs of the world. I think a lot of us need to organize information so it doesn't feel so chaotic, because the world's already chaotic. But the things we can know, it's nice to be able to organize those into models that we can quickly organize, quickly sort, and quickly use to help make really good decisions. So I think model thinking in maps and models of information and understanding is really helpful for us. So I think if we can find ways to map and model the things that are in our minds and hearts and really process all the chaos of the world through those maps and models, it gives us a sense of centeredness moving forward in our lives. And I think that sense of centeredness is so key. And for some reason, from the time I can remember as being a little kid, I had what I would call lowest common denominator thinking in my life. For some reason, I have this intuitive sense of boiling things down to their core component, as far as life goes. And when I think about all of this, and you think about all the stresses and anxieties of your life, and you think of all the worries you have, when you really boil it down, ultimately, and we started off the podcast talking about how I don't necessarily fear death. I don't want to die, but I don't necessarily fear it as much as I fear suffering. But that death thing is really the key of what's happening here for all of us, is our existence ending and the people we love, their existence ending, or any system that would indicate those two possibilities, right? Ultimately, we want to survive and we want to live on. Our egos want to continue on. And I think the one thing that I keep reflecting on, again, thinking about opportunities, is how can I be thinking about my ego and what I want and what's so important to me, I, and pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and really get clear about what it is that I'm actually concerned about here. What am I preserving? And now, obviously, it's my life. I want to live. I'm sure you feel the same way listening. You probably want to live, and you want the people that you love to live. And ultimately, we're talking about survival at the core of all of this. It's really the underpinning of our anxieties is, oh no, am I going to make it through? Am I going to be snuffed out of the world, or will my ego and my essence continue on after a crisis happens on a global scale? And I think this helps us get really clear about our ego, and it's an opportunity, again, for us to work on our ego. It's an opportunity for us to really check in and go, why do I believe I'm that important? And I think you are important. If you're listening, I think you're important. I don't think you're unimportant. I think I'm important. But why do I think that? Where does my place in all of this lie? Where does my survival, where does my ego come to play in all of this? And I think that's really at the core of it. When you boil it down and you just cut out all the systems and the sources of anxiety and people freaking out or unsure, what's going to happen in the future, the unknown, the chaos of the world. We really want a sense of, I will survive and move forward in ourselves. And I think that ego opportunity is so profound that this might be an amazing time period for you to focus in on that and see that for yourself and see those elements that you're preserving and asking the question, to what end? What am I preserving? Why is it so important that I have toilet paper in my house? Like, why am I freaking out about not having toilet paper, if that's what you're freaking out about? Well, it's the comfort of it probably, but also there's probably some survival mechanisms coming up in that. And if you trace that down to its core, it's all based on wanting to continue on. Our egos want to live, and that's really the desire of our hearts.
Yeah, I think having some modesty is good. This is a time period where I think our egos can really develop some true modesty. I think that's fantastic. To piggyback off of that, one more model that comes up for me, of course, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because a lot of us are fearing, we're not feeling safe and secure. A lot of people are not feeling safe and secure. I even think some of this sort of cavalier, like the people who are like, it's not going to affect me, it doesn't matter, I'm young or whatever. I actually think that that's a rebellious feeling against it. It's not like they're not feeling it, because this is in the collective unconscious. I think it's that person not wanting to be in the grip of that feeling, and so they push it away. But regardless if I'm right about that or not, I think that we're feeling insecure in our safety and security, and we're also being pushed down to a survival level. So just to give a couple practical, suggestions on how to calm that part of you down. Again, I'm no expert at survival. Right? This is the first time I've ever gone through anything that has made me feel, like this before. So I'm just going to tell you what we're doing, and hopefully it works for you as well. But almost kind of like in your cognitive function stack, when you go to your inferior or 3-year-old function, when you're in the grip, when the baby of your cognitive functions in your car model wants attention, one of the best things you can do is go give it some healthy attention, not to ignore it. And not to indulge its temper tantrums, but to be, to deal with it in a positive way. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we're being pushed down to the survival level, then the best thing to do is to not ignore it, nor is it to indulge in its temper tantrum, but rather deal with it in a healthy way. So that means right now, be as healthy as you can. Stay on a routine if you can, as much as you can. That doesn't mean that you're going to be able to stay on the same routine that you're used to every day, but try to find the rhythm of your life as much as possible. There's a metronome to most of our lives. So try to get in sync with your metronome as close as possible. And that means taking care of your physical health. That means not just avoiding contamination by, some sort of virus or whatever, but it means getting good sleep at night. It means eating good food. It means doing the daily habits of drinking plenty of water and exercising and getting out into nature. We might be doing social distancing right now, which of course has its own challenges, but we don't have to distance ourselves from nature. And we can do what's called forest bathing, which is bathing yourself in nature. So go get some vitamin D and get some sun every day. Do what you can to keep your physical health in a good place, if that is at all possible. And in that way, you'll calm some of that anxiety down, because you're not ignoring the survival part of you that's anxious, but you're also not handing yourself over to its grip. You're being proactive about it by handling and being safe with your own health. And of course, right now, do what you can to wash your hands on a regular basis. Don't touch people if you can, stay 6 feet away, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say give attention to that part of you and do it in a proactive, healthy way.
So I think the rule of thumb there is look at the animal part of you. That's what's at the base of all of it, the physicality. And I notice when I'm stressed and things, that if I just go run on a treadmill or take a walk outside, if it's a nice day, I can release a lot of that stress and get endorphins in my body. I mean, it's really basic, simple stuff, but just taking care of the physical body can be powerful. I like no drinking. If you're smoking, stop smoking. Get rest. All these little animal things of your body, the basic building blocks of who you are, start taking care of your health. And I think that's going to help your mental state and your emotional state too, because it all filters up from there. Like we have so many constructs in our lives, so many emotions and mental things that we're stressed, quote unquote, out about. And really the physicality is where that all starts. So our physicality is really important. So I think that's where you can focus on that animal part of yourself. So we've talked a little bit about a lot of different things here, some maps and models. We talked a little bit about the crisis that we seem to find ourselves in on the planet. And I think we're going to be okay, but we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts right now? What's your experience like? Where are you in the world, and what's happening in your local community, in your country? We want to hear your story. We want to hear what are your anxieties. What are you doing in your own life to manage some of those? And how are you thinking about the future? How are you thinking about the people you love and about yourself? What did we talk about in this podcast with you? You couldn't talk back because you didn't have a microphone, but what did we talk about with you that really spoke to you or triggered a thought or an idea or a story in your mind? We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Most likely you're at home right now. You don't have anywhere to go because a lot of people in the world are. So you've got time to do this. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Underneath this podcast, leave us your story, a comment, question. Leave us the feedback. Let's get a conversation started, and let's continue the digital community here of Personality Hacker, conversing with each other, finding solutions for our lives, and helping us become even better people as we move forward.
Of course, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. We've told you in the past to prepare for the apocalypse, to buy 11 copies, and
it's still for sale.
It's still for sale. So if you want those 11 copies, 1 to rebuild civilization and 10 for toilet paper. We never even thought about toilet paper.
I didn't think it would be a thing.
I didn't think so either, but
if you do happen to get 11 copies, I want you to take a picture of it. Make sure you tag us on like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, somewhere, and we'll totally push it out to all of our networks and like retweet it or re-message it somehow, because I think it'll be hilarious if there's like a picture of you in your bedroom like with 11 copies, you're sitting on top of it preparing for the apocalypse. I think that would be kind of funny.
Yeah, absolutely. On a personal note, Joel and I want to let you know that if you're going through a time period of real struggle, if somebody in your family is sick right now, maybe hospitalized, maybe you are, if you're going through some serious financial struggles, or you're just really worried about how this is all going to pan out, we just want you to know that we love you, we're thinking about you, and we are a resilient species. Like, we have been through a lot as animals, as a species of humans. We have been through a lot, and one of the best ways that we can get through this is just send as much positive, loving vibes out there, and we want you to know that we're just pumping those out. We are just pumping those vibes out to you, and that, you know, we love you, and we may not be able to actually be there for you and have your back, but mimetically and psychologically and energetically, we have your back. So take care of each other, take care of your loved ones, and and we'll get through this and whatever life throws at us.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.